welcome to the lecture series from the State Museum of Egyptian Art in Munich. Today, we will be looking at Nectanebos II, the pharaoh, the myth, the legend. Nectanebos, or Nectanebos II, was the third and last king of the 30th dynasty. He was the last native ruler of Egypt and ruled around 360 to 343 BC. His Egyptian name was Machtübernahme. Now, as we see, his name was Nectanebos II, which means there was a Nectanebos I. However, oddly enough, he did not have the same Egyptian name. He was the first ruler of the same dynasty, the 30th, and he was called Nectanebos, whereas ours is called Machtübernahme. Powerful or victorious is the Horus of the town of Hebit. This comes from the Greeks, who wrote the names of Egyptian pharaohs in their own way. And they wrote the name of the first Nectanebos, Nectanebos, as Nectanebis, and the one of the second one, ours, as Nectanebos. And Egyptologists just kind of assumed it was the same name before they could read hieroglyphs and gave them the names Nectanebos I and II. Nectanebos probably came to power through a military push that probably also did away with the last pharaoh of the previous dynasty, the 29th. He was a general from the town of Senebenitos, which he made into the new capital. And he had a son called Jedhor, whom he soon installed as a co-regent. So they were both pharaohs of equal value, so to speak, and both ruled Egypt. About this family, now we have Nectanebos I. We have his son Jedhor, and then we have the father of our king, who is a man called Shahapimu. As we can see, Nectanebos II was not in the direct line of succession, and Shahapimu has the title chief of the armies or commander of the armies and king's brother, but not the titles king's son, which suggests that he was a brother of Nectanebos, the first Nectanebos, as this one was not descended from a king, whereas Jedhor would have been. So Shahapimu would have been Jedhor's uncle, and our Nectanebos, Machtübernahme, would have been the reigning pharaoh Jedhor's nephew. We don't know much about his mother. We do have a sarcophagus from a woman called Ujashu, who also, again, only has the title king's mother, but is not a king's sister or a king's wife, a great royal wife. So we do know she was not married to a king, but she was mother to a king. So it makes it likely in this case that she was the mother of Machtübernahme or Nectanebos II. These are her titles, which you can see in a bit more detail. Now, at the time, we'll be getting back to this, but Egypt was currently under independent rule, but was still in danger from the expanding Persian Empire of the Achaemenids family. And we have a very interesting document from much later, from under the Ptolemies, called the Demotic Chronicle, that talks about the native kings after the first Persian occupation up to our Nectanebos, so he's not included. And what they have to say about the joint rule of Nectanebos and Jedhor, about the one who is reigning on this day, namely Nectanebos, one says, he is the one who has squandered all of Egypt's possessions and temples in exchange for money. So it seems as though he's siphoning off goods that are normally used for the temple in order to make money. The Egyptians at the time did not have a currency. They had a system of equal value exchange, which means that objects were given a value and were exchanged with each other, but not for any form of coinage or any other form of currency. However, they did need more troops. And to pay those troops, which were usually mercenaries from the Greek city-states, and they liked to be paid in money. So the first person to mint money in Egypt was Jethor. The one you see here is actually from our Nectanebos, Nachtwahhabit, and was minted specifically to pay mercenaries. It's called the gold stater, and as you can see on one side it has a horse for reasons, probably because it's to pay mercenaries, and on the other it has the Egyptian signs for perfect or pure and the sign for gold, saying that this was a coin of pure gold. And this gold would theoretically have been something that would have gone to the temples. Gold was usually used either to exchange for goods outside of Egypt or within Egypt to beautify the temples, or so that the temple workshops could make luxury goods that could be bought and further sold throughout Egypt. So this is in part true. However, we do know that neither Nectanebos nor Jethor ignored their other duties to the temples as they continued to build, which was one of the main duties of the pharaoh towards the gods. We know that they built the temple of Kunst. There's a little chapel there in Karnak that is dated to Jethor, and various pieces have survived from the city of Kantir. Now, we are currently after the first Persian occupation, as I have said. This is the Achaemenid Empire, and in 525 it first occupied Egypt. However, internal problems within the empire meant that around 404 BC, Egypt was able to reassert its independence. However, the Persian Empire never stopped trying to take over Egypt. Jethor had to repulse an invasion in 374 to 373 BCE. And soon after that, around 360, he decided to actively prepare for war and do a sort of preemptive strike. Helping also Phoenician rebels, I think, was the idea. Why was the Persian Empire so interested in Egypt? For once, it is, of course, a further step towards the hegemony of the entire Mediterranean, as it is the only way to get to the rest of North Africa and the various Mediterranean ports that were along the Mediterranean trade route, which was a circular route of exchanging trade goods. But another thing was that Egypt was also the corridor to Central Africa. And these also had trade goods that were of interest to them, including ebony, incense, which was used in most religions of the time, and various animal products that would come from Central Africa, as well as gold, which was taken from Nubia, just south of Egypt. However, Egypt had a very flourishing agriculture. It was a very fertile land due to the Nile inundation that would bring new fertile soil every year from the highlands of Ethiopia. So every year they had new soil that hadn't been used by agriculture, and they were able to produce a lot of grain, and an army marches on its stomach. In fact, later on, the Roman Empire, the nobility of the empire, any of the high-ranking people, were not allowed to set foot in Egypt without the express permission of the emperor himself, because they were afraid that once they were in Egypt, if they seized control, they would have control of enough grain, of enough wheat to fund their own army. So while the luxury items that they could get through having the means to control the trade that was flowing from and through Egypt was a great concern, another concern was really simply food. In any case, Jethor starts preparing for a bigger campaign around 360 BC, and around 358 he sets off and decides to lead this army himself. Against the Persian king of the time was Artaxerxes II. So he takes with him his cousin, Nachtwahhabit, and the forces of 2 Greek mercenaries. One is led by General Chabrias of Athens, and the other by Agesilaus of Sparta, who was king of Sparta and an octogenarian at the time. So he's leaving his capital behind, and of course he needs to install someone there so that he has somebody to rule Egypt while he's away. And he decides to leave Chahapimu, his probably uncle. Chahapimu takes advantage of the situation and seizes power. However, he doesn't seize it for himself. We're not quite sure why. It's possible that since he is part of the first generation of that dynasty, he felt that the legitimacy wouldn't be quite enough to keep him on the throne, and decided instead to send a messenger to his son at the front with his Egyptian troops and offer the throne to him. Nacht-hor-hebit accepts, which of course puts Jethor in a bit of a bind, because he's just lost all of his Egyptian troops. About 80,000 according to Diodorus Siculus. So of course he turns to his allies. We're going to go back one. His Greek allies, Chabrias and Agesilaus. And reportedly, Agesilaus simply answered that he had been paid to defend Egypt, not attack it, effectively siding with Nacht-hor-hebit. Chabrias decided to wash his hands of the whole affair, returned to Athens, and was not seen again until Athens was embroiled into the next war. Jethor, of course, now had nowhere to go. He could not return to Egypt, and so there was only one direction he could really go, and he fled to the Persian Empire, possibly with his physician. The sarcophagus you see here is from a man called Wennefer, who definitely spent some time in Persia. We don't know how long, and we don't know exactly at what time. But we do know he came back to Egypt at some point and then became a funerary priest of the king's father, Chahapimu. This doesn't mean that Chahapimu was still alive at the time. Obviously, it can be decades later. We do know that Jethor died of natural causes in the Persian court. So now Nectanebos II, Nacht-hor-hebit, had to return to Egypt to be crowned, and he took on the 5 titular names of the Egyptian kings: Horus, who loves the 2 lands, who protects Egypt; Nebti, who satisfies the heart of the gods and who approaches the foreign lands; Golden Horus, who causes the laws to endure, who defeats the 9 bows; the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, who delights the heart of Re; chosen one of Hathor or Anuris, depending on where he's writing it; and the son of Re, his birth name, the strong Horus of Nebit, or the victorious Horus of Nebit. Hacht, Nacht, Hor, Hebit. Hebit is the town of Beit el-Hagar. Now, he was hardly back in Egypt for very long, presumably back to his wife. Again, we're not entirely certain. We do have a sarcophagus and some canopic jars of a woman called Neit Kerep Binet Bint. Now, the sarcophagus more or less fits into the time period we're talking about, but her canopic jars and her servant statuettes, or usheptis, are a bit earlier. Her tomb was plundered. It was left open to the elements. Inside the tomb, a servant statuette, an ushepti of Nacht-hor-hebit, was found. So, this woman is a king's daughter and a king's wife, which means if she was the wife of Nacht-hor-hebit, then she was a daughter of either Nectanebos I, or Jethor, making her either Nacht-hor-hebit's cousin or his aunt. This is not unusual in ancient Egyptian royal families. And we do know she was king's wife, and that would fit. However, since not everything really fits in date, it could also be that she reused some old funerary equipment that was in storage. It's also entirely possible that she was the wife of Amasis and daughter of Apries in the 26th dynasty instead, and that the Ushepti belonging to Nectanebos had been was intrusive, had come in during a flash flood or something similar. However, it is not unusual for a member of the king's family to have Usheptis with the name of the ruling king in their tombs. So, again, a little archaeological mystery. Here are her titles once again. So, he wasn't home for very long when there was an insurrection centered around Mendes, which was the capital before the 30th dynasty, which makes it very likely that the person leading this insurrection was in some way related to the previous royal family. Let's remember, these are just 3 generations later. So somebody's grandfather was king and or grand uncle, great uncle, and they decided that they were much more legitimate than this scion of the usurpers. Unfortunately, we don't know his name. We do know that he did contact Agesilaus of Sparta to see if he could get him on his side. Agesilaus of Sparta remained with Nectanebos, and they managed to put down the rebellion. After this, Agesilaus of Sparta decided to go home. He was 84. He was also 200 Greek talents richer. Unfortunately, he died in Kyramaika on the way home. His body was embalmed in wax, and he was buried in Sparta. In the first few years of his reign, Nectanebos was able to do pharaoh things, which involved, among other things, burying the Apis bull. The Apis bull was thought to be the living incarnation of the god Ptah. And when the current reigning bull died, he was buried with much pomp and circumstances. He was properly embalmed with a funerary mask and was put in a big sarcophagus and everything. And he was buried in a series of galleries called the Serapeum in Saqqara. Now, it is not, considering the general lifespan of bulls, it's not unusual for a king to have to bury one or more. Once the current reigning Apis bull was buried, they would search for bulls having certain specific characteristics that were the next incarnation. So we do know that Nectanebos did bury a bull. We have a stela of him that says exactly that. We do know that he did some construction work on the Serapeum and a fair amount of building elsewhere. Obviously, in Behbet el-Hagar, since his name is contains that of the god Horus of Behbet el-Hagar, the temple actually belongs to Horus's mother, Isis. We also have evidence of him. We know he built a new temple to Khnum on Elephantina. We know that he built temples in Sebenitos, in Abu Saktam, and he's responsible for the lovely shrine you can still see in Edfu. Also, as a sign, among other things, of legitimation, but in this case also of the special protection that Horus of Hebit, of Behbet el-Hagar, afforded Nectanebos II. There are several statues showing him between the legs of a falcon. This is something that's fairly common for sphinxes, where you would see the king being protected by a sphinx in the guise of a god, as opposed to one showing the king. But statues of the god, a falcon god, have been known since the Old Kingdom. And here we have 3 lovely examples. One is here in our museum, that's the left one. Please come visit us. Another in the middle can be found in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and the one on the 4th is from the Louvre in Paris. Now, of course, the Persian threat did not go away just because Egypt had a change of rulers. There was an attempt to invade Egypt in 351 to 350 BCE. In that time, Persia had also changed rulers. We are now at Artaxerxes III. But Nectanebos was able to push him back with the help of new Greek mercenary friends. We're going a bit ahead here. Diophantus of Athens and Lamias of Sparta. He also found some other allies. Let's go back one. Tabnit of Sidon, that was currently rebelling against the Persian Empire. And Nacht-Hotep decided to help him, probably through goods and money, but also by paying for a mercenary called Mentor of Rhodes to help him out with 4,000 of his foot soldiers. Interestingly enough, as we can see, Tabnit of Sidon was buried in an Egyptian sarcophagus, originally belonging to a general called Ptah, to which he added an additional inscription in the Phoenician script, saying that there wasn't any gold or jewels in this sarcophagus, so there was no point in opening it and violating the body. Now, this all sounds rather positive. However, in about 343 BCE, the Persians started amassing a huge army. This is what Egypt had. And meanwhile, Persia had written to the Greek city-states. Now, they wanted to march specifically against Egypt, and to get there, they would have to go through Sidon. Now, they had about 300,000 foot soldiers, 30,000 cavalry, supposedly, according to the Greek sources, 300 triremes, as well as 500 transport ships. And apparently this was not considered enough to march against Egypt. So they contacted the Greek city-states, and Athens and Sparta, who had already committed mercenaries to Egypt, declined. But Thebes and Argos sent 1,000 and 3,000 troops, respectively. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Nectanebos had 20,000 Greek and 20,000 Libyan mercenaries, along with 60,000 native troops. And still, the Persians were not taking any chances. Now, in view of all this, and with the fall of the capital of Sidon in Phoenicia, Mentor of Rhodes and Tabnit of Sidon opened negotiations with the Persians, which is one thing. However, they failed to tell Egypt about it. So they are now on the side of the Persians. They have added their troops to the Persian army, and Egypt knows nothing about it. Now, Nectanebos's first idea was to defend the delta. The Persians divided their army into two. One would take the land route and one would come by sea. Nectanebos seems to have, possibly acting on outdated or even wrong information from his previous allies, seemed to think that there would be a purely naval invasion, and he focused on defending the delta. However, as you can see, the Nile Delta, this shows the modern arms and some of the ancient arms. The arms shifted a lot during history. These are the branches of the Nile that flow into the Mediterranean. However, there were also a huge amount of canals that were used for irrigation. Now, not all of them would have necessarily supported the big ships, and that was probably what Nectanebos was counting on by closing as much as he could off with a series of flat-bottomed boats. However, Nicostratus, who commanded the one part of the army with 80 triremes and 5,000 troops, managed to find a side canal that had not been defended. And he managed to get behind the Egyptian lines and attack, and beat the Egyptian fleet there. Meanwhile, further troops had marched in overland. They suffered a lot of losses, among other things, through the march through the Sinai, the swamps of Lake Serbonis, and various border forts. But they still managed to get to Egypt, again, behind the Egyptian lines, and they were able to attack and take Bubastis. a city in the eastern delta. In view of these defeats, we do know that Nectanebos, that Nacht-Hor-Hebit, fled southwards. He is attested in Edfu with the year 18, so he managed to hold the line somewhere south of the delta for at least 2 more years. After that, we know he fled to Nubia, to the land south of Egypt, and we don't know what happened to him there. It is entirely possible that a special someone who was in the Egyptian army defected. We have this lovely statue that was in a private collection, mentioning someone who has the titles General of the Armies and King's Son. We know that it dates to Nacht-Hor-Hebit because it mentions some of his construction work with the name of the king. So it seems very likely that this was one of his sons. And we know that this person was campaigning in a foreign country where the goddess Isis ensured that he found favor in the heart of her foreign king, and that the goddess eventually led him home. So he seems to have found refuge in the Persian court and eventually returned to Egypt, where he had the statue commissioned. Although he did not die in Egypt, Nacht-Hor-Hebit did have a whole Egyptian burial, of which pieces have been found, including some of his usheptes, one of which, again, is in our collection, and a very lovely sarcophagus trough that was taken to Alexandria sometime during the Ptolemies. It's the 1st centuries BCE. Eventually made its way to the church of Saint Athanasius, where it was probably used as a baptism basin. The church was later turned into a mosque where it was used as a ritual bath, and 16 holes were drilled at the bottom to allow the water to drain. And that is where scholars found it. It has a very classical decoration of the certain hours of the Amduat, which is an afterlife text that has been common for kings since the New Kingdom, since about 1500 BC, as well as depictions of various afterlife deities. Now, you would think that this is the end of Nacht-Hor-Hebit's story. It is not. This is where the legend of Nectanebos begins. And it begins relatively early, under the Ptolemies. Now, the Ptolemies were a Macedonian dynasty that followed Alexander the Great in Egypt. And so this is the story of the dream of Nectanebo, which exists in both a Greek version and a Demotic version, which is the language that was spoken by the native Egyptians. There was still a very flourishing native culture. So this is a tale that may very well have sprung from the Egyptians themselves. Now it only survives in a rather fragmentary form. The native version, the Demotic version, is even more fragmentary than the Greek one. And it talks about a dream that Nectanebos had in the year 16 of his reign, which would have been the year that the Persians attacked. Now, he was in Mendes, the capital before the Sebenitos, and he was giving an offering for the full moon, and during this offering, he asked the gods to give him insight into the future. Afterwards, he lay down to rest, and the gods gave him a vision of the god Onuris complaining that his temple wasn't ready yet, and that Nectanebos should get a move on. Nectanebos wakes up. He decides to see what's going on with the temple of Onuris, or Anhur, in Sebenitos, and indeed the hieroglyphic inscriptions in the sanctuary where the statue of the god would come were not finished yet. So he decides to call for a very well-known sculptor who was known for working fast and well, named Petaisis, offered him a lot of money and sent him to Sebenitos. Petaisis was very happy to have his advance. He took it in hand and spent it on a night of drinking. At some point, he managed to find himself within the temple, though not the place he was actually supposed to be, but someplace in the south of the temple, where he met a lovely woman called Hatshepsut. And she was a vision. He thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and this is where the manuscript breaks off. Now, you might imagine that he basically bungles everything, that the gods are unhappy, and that's why they send the Persian army or whatever. However, there is a sequel that suggests that things went on slightly differently than what you might expect. In this sequel, it explains what happened after Peteizes had gone to Sebennytos and had apparently had some sort of vision. In the year 16 of Nectanebos, an excellent king of the entire land who made Egypt flourish in all good things in his time, one day Pharaoh said, "My heart is heavy because of the things that happened to Peteizes, son of Pharaoh, in the temple of Sebennytos. I have given orders to find out in what sort of time these things will happen. I have given orders to find out the nature of the foreigners who will come after me. I have given orders to find out what hardships they will cause when they reside in Egypt." So apparently the gods did answer Nectanebos' plea to know the future, but not directly. First, he had to get somebody to go to Sebennytos and finish the sanctuary, and that person was given the vision of the future. Now, the lady, Hatshepsut, is called Hathor is noble, so it's entirely possible that she was actually a goddess in disguise and that she was responsible for giving him those visions. So that was an interesting thing that also shows that there was a knowledge of the history of Egypt at that time, meaning that Egypt would then be conquered by a foreign army. You would think this may be the end. No, it is not. We have, first, admire reliefs from the sanctuary of Sebennytos that were presumably finished by Peteizes, if we can believe the story. But hundreds of years later, we have a number of novels that, well, they're basically novelizations of the life of Alexander the Great. And they exist in a huge number of languages, in Greek, in Latin, in Armenian, in Syrian, and in later on as novels in the native languages of various countries became common, in French, in English, and various other languages. And it all starts in Egypt, where King Nectanebos, a great magician, is able to defeat all his enemies due to his magic. And you can see him here. He has a little basin, and in his basin he has little toy ships. And with these ships, using sympathetic magic, he could defeat armies and obviously navies that were hundreds of miles away. But one day, he realizes that in his little models, the enemy boats are being piloted by the Egyptian gods themselves, meaning that defeat was the will of the gods. Not one to go against the will of the gods, Nectanebos packs all his things and leaves Egypt, where he offered his services as an Egyptian magician, which apparently was a thing at the time, or was thought to be a thing at the time. Now, he eventually comes to the court of Philip II of Macedonia. Now, hundreds of years went by between Nectanebos and Philip II of Macedonia. There was a whole Persian invasion. That happened. So either as an Egyptian mage he could live very long, or they got the timeline wrong. In any case, he appears at the court of Philip II of Macedonia. Philip himself is off campaigning, but his wife Olympia is at home. And she's very intrigued by this man who has gotten a bit of a reputation. And so he comes before her, he gives her a horoscope. And because she's very, very pretty, he decides to tell her that the stars have told him that she is destined to give birth to an amazing king, that would be fathered by a god, namely the god Amun of Egypt. She seems very excited at the prospect, so he goes off and gathers some hallucinogenic plants, which he feeds to her, and through that and his magic, he manages to convince her that the person appearing in her bedroom shifts through a variety of shapes, including a serpent, or here a ram-headed god, namely a very typically Egyptian depiction of Amun, and eventually taking on the handsome countenance of Nectanebos II. They lie together, and the next day the queen talks all about how she was visited by a god, and it seems he was a fairly good lover because she'd like to do it again. Now, insofar as these medieval romances very often have some sort of moral in it, this is where she becomes an adulteress. Because if a god appears to you and wants to sleep with you, you sleep with the god. But if you decide you want the god to come back, then you are an adulteress. In any case, Nectanebos is not against it. They sleep together again. She falls pregnant, and they have a little panic about what Philip will have to say about that. Nectanebos decides to send him a prophetic dream in the shape of a falcon. And so Philip comes back from his campaign knowing that a god has been visiting his wife and that she is pregnant with the scion of divinity. And at first he's fine with it, but eventually he gets a bit jealous and accuses her of sleeping with a mortal man rather than a god, whereupon Nectanebos works his magic again and appears as a winged serpent that flies through the air and kisses Olympia on the cheek, thus cementing forever that the child is really that of a god. So as you can see, it has been illustrated in a variety of ways, including this very lovely manuscript from the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, where you can see the whole story from Nectanebos with his ships, to the horoscope, to the first time he visits her, to the second time, to that's part of the vision that was sent to Philip of Macedon. And then from another manuscript, we have, this is the one you find the most often, the serpent kissing Olympia. Now, this is something extremely Egyptian. Technically, all reigning pharaohs were considered not the son of the previous pharaoh, although that did add legitimacy, but the son of the god. Whoever was the main god of Egypt at the time, for the longest time in its history, it was Amun. Yes, the same Amun. Here he is shown wearing his tall feather crown, which was a slightly more common depiction of him in ancient Egypt. In the first one, he is giving the breath of life to the queen. Now, he appeared in the guise of her husband in this case. So he's giving the breath of life to the queen. In the second, you see him giving life to the unborn child, which has just been fashioned by the god Khnum on his potter's wheel. And in the third, you see the god Thoth telling the queen that she is pregnant with the next king of Egypt. So this was very much an Egyptian thing, to have a king gain legitimacy through being the child of Amun. And it is something that historically Alexander the Great banked upon. When he was set to invade Egypt, he stopped by the oasis of Siva and got the oracle there to recognize him as the son of Amun, which means by the time he actually arrived in Egypt, he had a form of religious legitimacy. What these tales do is give him a further form of legitimacy by making, these are all also written at a time and under monotheistic culture, so obviously there was no actual god Amun for those people writing it, but oddly enough manages to give him a second legitimacy by making him the son of the last native Egyptian king. making Alexander the Great then, of course, the perfect man to boot the foreigners out of Egypt and to be crowned its next pharaoh. I hope you enjoyed our journey from Nectanebos as the son of a general to a mythic figure who can turn himself into a god and father kings centuries after he died. And I hope you will come and visit us someday in Munich, with the State Museum of Egyptian Art, and we wish you a good day.